Hello, my lovelies. This is Miss Murder with another tale of terror for you. I'm going to do this one and get back to my movies for a while. This, however, is kind of a labor of love. Well, no, it's a labor of like because it was a story that hit me on several different levels. And it's not a slasher, it's not a, guts pouring out everywhere, but it does have mature themes and language, so please be advised. It's from Stephen King, so you know it's going to be a long one because Stephen King doesn't believe in word limits. And it was first published in 1992 in a compilation book called Shock Rock. And later in the 2000s, he put it in his Nightmares and Dreamscape anthology. And then I found from 2006 where they had done a TV movie on TNT of this story and others from that book. So there were some updates and they had cheapened some down and it got panned because it wasn't scary. Well, the elements that made it scary kind of got tossed when they had to fit it onto TV. Why did this one appeal to me? And I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you why it's worth listening to or reading if you don't like my voice, which I wouldn't blame you in the slightest. So why did I pick this particular one? Well, number one, it was written by Stephen King, so I have always liked his stories from the 80s onwards. The number two reason I like this story, it's set in Oregon, and how can I resist that? And while Stephen gets the main landmarks okay, he kind of muddles up the directions a bit, and I don't blame him. And I'm sure the people of Umpqua National Forest thank him for that. They don't have thousands of people ripping up forest roads out there trying to find rock and roll heaven. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you for giving Oregon the reputation of being where all the weird people go. And number three, it is a tribute, although a sideways type of compliment tribute to a lot of the greats that we lost. Now, if you're the person that sits there and says, I wish I'd been alive when Nirvana was playing, you're not going to be interested in this story. This is for us grown-ups, okay? This is for those of us who appreciated the good stuff that was the basis for the stuff that you listen to today. And if you think grunge was brand new, you're wrong. If you think heavy metal's brand new, you're wrong. And if you think techno is new, well, yeah, it's new, but that doesn't make it good. It's Stephen King's You Know They've Got a Hell of a Band. When Mary woke up, they were lost. She knew it, and Clark knew it too, although he didn't want to admit it first. He was wearing his I'm pissed look, where his mouth kept getting smaller and smaller until you thought it might disappear altogether. And quote, quote, lost wasn't how Clark would put it. Clark would say they had, quote, quote, taken a wrong turn somewhere, and he would grudge even that. They'd set off from Portland the day before. Clark worked for a computer company, one of the giants, and it had been his idea that they should see something of Oregon besides the pleasant but anonymous upper-middle-class suburb of Portland that was known as Software City. And Miss Murder says, hey, watch it, bud. Back to the story. They say it's beautiful out there in the boonies, he had told her. You want to go take a look? I've got a week and the transfer rumors have already started. If we don't see some of the real Oregon, I think the last 16 months are going to be nothing but a black hole in my memory. She had agreed willingly enough. School had let out 10 days before and she had no summer classes to teach, and it was just the two of them still, although not for want of trying. Enjoying the pleasantly haphazard catch-as-catch-can feel of the trip, forgetting that spur-of-the-moment vacations often ended up just like this, with the vacationers lost along some back road that blundered its way up to overgrown poop chute of nowhere. Miss Murder as getting past. Leave Oregon alone. Back to the story. And at the age of 32, she was a little too old to see getting lost as just another adventure. Her idea of a vacation was a motel with bathrobes on the bed and a hairdryer in the bathroom. Yesterday had been fine, the countryside so gorgeous that Miss Murder says thank you very much, back to story, that even Clark had several times been awed to an unaccustomed silence. They had spent the night at a nice country inn just west of Eugene, had made love not once but twice, something she was most definitely not too old to enjoy, and this morning had headed south, meaning to spend the night in Klamath Falls. They had started out on Oregon State Highway 58, and that was all right, but then over lunch in the town of Oak Ridge, Clark had suggested they get off the main highway, which was pretty well clogged with RVs and logging trucks. Well, I don't know. Mary spoke with the dubiousness of a woman who has heard many such proposals from her man and endured the consequences of a few. I'd hate to get lost out there, Clark. It looks pretty empty. She had tapped one neatly shaped nail on a spot of green on the map marked Boulder Creek Wilderness Area. That word is wilderness, as in no motels. Ah, come on, he said, pushing aside the remains of his chicken fried steak. On the juke, Steve Earle and the Dukes were singing 6 Days on the Road, and outside the dirt-streaked windows, a bunch of bored-looking kids were doing turns and pop-outs on their skateboards. They looked as if they simply couldn't wait to get the hell out of Oak Ridge, and Mary knew exactly how they felt. Nothing to it, babe. We take 58 a few more miles east, then turn south on State Road 42. See it? Uh-huh. She also saw that, while Highway 58 was a fat red line, State Road 42 was only a squiggle of black thread. But she was full of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and she hadn't wanted to argue with Clark's pioneering instinct while in such a condition. What she'd wanted, in fact, was to tilt back the passenger seat of their lovely old Mercedes and take a snooze. Then he pushed on. There's this road here. It's not numbered, so it's probably only a country road, but it goes right down to Tragically Falls. And from there, it's only a hop and a jump over to US 97. So what do you think? That you'll probably get us lost, she'd said, a wisecrack she rather regretted later. But I guess we'll be all right as long as you can find a place wide enough to turn the princess around in. Sold American, he said, beaming. He pulled his chicken fried steak back in front of him and began to eat again, congealed gravy and all. "Uck-a-doo," she said, holding one hand in front of her face and wincing. "How can you? It's good. Besides, when one is traveling, one should eat the native dishes." "It looks like somebody sneezed a mouthful of snuff onto a very old hamburger," she said. They left Oak Ridge in good spirits, and at first all had gone well. Trouble hadn't set in until they turned off SR 42 and onto the unmarked road, the one Clark had been so sure was going to breeze them right into Tragically Falls. It hadn't seemed like trouble at first. Country road or not, the new way had been a lot better than SR 42, which had been potholed and frost-heaved even in summer. They had gone along famously, in fact, taking turns plugging tapes into the dashboard player. Clark was into people like Wilson Pickett, Al Green, and the Staple Singers. Mary's taste lay in entirely different directions. "What do you see in all these white boys?" he asked as she plugged in her current favorite, Lou Reed's New York. "Married one, didn't I?" she asked, and that made him laugh. The first sign of trouble came 15 minutes later when they came to a fork in the road. Both forks looked equally promising. "Holy crap," Clark said, pulling up and popping open the glove compartment so he could get at the map. He looked at it for a long time. "That isn't on the map." "Oh, boy," Mary said. She had been on the edge of dozing off when Clark pulled up at the unexpected fork, and she was feeling a little irritated with him. "Want my advice?" "No," he said, sounding a little irritated himself. "But I suppose I'll get it, and I hate it when you roll your eyes at me that way, in case you didn't know." Which way is that, Clark? Like I'm an old dog that just farted under the dinner table? Go on, tell me what you think. Lay it on me. It's your nickel. Go back while there's still time. That's my advice. Uh-huh. He just sat there a while longer, alternating looks through the bug-splattered windshield with a close examination of the map. They had been married for almost 15 years, and Mary knew him well enough to know he meant to go on, not in spite of the unexpected fork in the road, but because of it. When Clark Willingham's balls are on the line, he doesn't back down, she thought, and snorted. He glanced at her, one eyebrow raised, and she had a sudden discomfiting thought. If she could read him after all this time, then maybe he could read her just as well. Something? He asked, and his voice was just a little too thin. It was at that moment, even before she had fallen asleep, she now realized that his mouth had started to get smaller. She shook her head. Just clearing my throat. He nodded, pushing his glasses up on his ever-expanding forehead, and brought the map up until it was almost touching the tip of his nose. Well, he said, it's got to be the left-hand fork because that's the one that goes south toward Tokety Falls. The other one heads east. It's probably a ranch road or something. A ranch road with a broken yellow line running down the middle of it? Clark's mouth grew a little smaller. You'd be surprised how well off some of these ranchers are, he said. She thought of pointing out to him that the days of scouts and pioneers were long gone, that his testicles were not actually on the line, but then decided she wanted a little doze in the afternoon sun a lot more than she wanted to squabble with her husband, especially after the lovely double feature last night. And, after all, they were bound to come out somewhere, weren't they? With that comforting thought in her mind and Lou Reed in her ears singing about the last great American whale, Mary Willingham dozed off. By the time the nifty yellow line in the middle of the unmarked road disappeared, she was sleeping shallowly and dreaming that they were back in the Oak Ridge Cafe where they had eaten lunch. She was trying to put a quarter in the jukebox, but the coin slot was plugged with something that looked like flesh. One of the kids had been outside in the parking lot, walked past her with his skateboard under his arm and his Trailblazers hat turned around on his head. What's the matter with this thing? Mary asked him. The kid came over, took a quick look, and shrugged. Ah, that ain't nothing, he said. That's just some guy's body, broken for you and for many. This is no rinky-dink operation we got here. We're talking mass culture, sugar muffin. Then he reached up, gave the tip of her right breast a tweak, not a very friendly one either, and walked away. When she looked back at the jukebox, she saw that a fine spray of blood had stippled the inside of the glass top. Maybe you better give that Lou Reed album a rest, she thought, and beyond the bloody glass, a record twirled under the turntable, as if at her thought, and Lou began to sing Busload of Faith. Chapter 2. While Mary was having the steadily more unpleasant dream, the road continued to deteriorate, the patches spreading until it was really all patch. The Lou Reed album, a long one, came to an end and began to play again. Clark didn't notice. The pleasant look he had started the day with was entirely gone. His mouth had shrunk to the size of a rosebud. If Mary had been awake, she would have coaxed him into turning around miles back. He knew this just as he knew how she would look at him if she woke up now and saw this narrow swatch of crumbling hot top, a road only if one thought in the most charitable of terms, with piney woods pressing in close enough on both sides to keep the patched tar in constant shadow. They had not passed a car headed in the other direction since leaving SR-42. He knew he should turn around. Mary hated it when he got into shit like this, always forgetting the many times he had found his way unerringly along strange roads to their planned destination. Clark Willingham was one of those millions of American men who are firmly convinced they have a compass in their heads. But he pushed on, at first convinced that they must come out in Tokety Falls. then just hoping. Besides, there was no place to turn around. If he tried to do so without at least a turnout, he would mire the princess to her hubcaps in one of the marshy ditches that bordered this miserable excuse for a road. And God knew how long it would take to get a tow truck in here. Then at last he did come to a place where he could have turned around, another fork in the road, and elected not to take it. The reason was simple. The left fork was rutted gravel with grass growing up the middle. To the right, however, the road was once again wide, well paved, and divided by a bright stroke of yellow. According to the compass in Clark's head, this fork headed dead south. He could all but smell Toketee Falls. 10 miles, maybe 15, 20 at the outside. No more than that. He did at least consider turning back, however. When he told Mary so later, he saw doubt in her eyes, but it was true. He decided to go on because Mary was beginning to stir, and he was quite sure that the bumpy, potholed stretch of road he'd just driven would wake her up if he turned back. And then she would look at him with those wide, beautiful blue eyes of hers. Just look. That would be enough. Besides, why should he spend an hour and a half going back when Toketee Falls was just a spin and a promise away? Look at that road, he thought. You think a road like that is just going to peter out? He put the princess back in gear, started down the right fork, and sure enough, the road petered out. Over the first hill, the yellow line disappeared again. Over the second, the paving gave out and they were on rutted dirt track with the dark woods pressing even closer on either side, and the sun, Clark was aware of this for the first time, now sliding down the wrong side of the sky. The pavement ended too suddenly for Clark to brake and baby the princess onto the new surface, and there was a hard, spring-jarring thud that woke Mary. She sat up with a jerk and looked around with wide eyes. "Where?" she began, and then, to make the afternoon utterly perfect and complete, the smoky voice of Lou Reed sped up until he was gabbling out the lyrics to Good Evening, Mr. Waldheim at the speed of Alvin and the Chipmunks. "Oh!" she said, and punched the eject button. The tape belched out, followed by an ugly brown afterbirth, coils of shiny tape. The princess hit a nearly bottomless pothole, lurched hard to the left, and then threw herself up and out like a clipper ship corkscrewing through a storm wave. "Clark, don't say anything," he said grimly. "We're not lost. We just took a wrong turn somewhere. This will turn back to Tara in just a minute or two, probably over the next hill. We are not lost." Still upset by her dream, even though she could not really remember what it had been, Mary held the ruined tape in her lap, mourning it. She supposed she could buy another one, but not out here. She looked at the brooding trees that seemed to belly right up to the road with somehow unseemly eagerness, and guessed it was a long way to the nearest Tower Records. She looked at Clark, saw that his cheeks were flushed and his mouth was smaller than ever, and decided it really would be wise to say nothing, at least not yet. Better just to sit quietly and hope he would come to his senses before this miserable excuse for a road petered out into a gravel pit or a quicksand bog. "Besides, I can't very well turn around," he said, as if she had suggested that very thing. "I can see that," she replied neutrally. He glanced at her, perhaps wanting to fight, perhaps just feeling embarrassed and hoping to see she wasn't too mad at him, at least not yet, and then looked back through the windshield. Now there were weeds growing up in the center of this road, and if they did meet another car, one of them would have to back up. Nor was that the end of the fun. The ground beyond the wheel ruts looked increasingly untrustworthy. The scrubby trees seemed to be jostling each other for position in the wet ground. There were no power poles on either side of the road. She almost pointed this out to Clark, then decided it might be smarter to hold her tongue about that too. He drove on in silence until they came around a down-slanting curve. He was hoping against hope that they would see a change for the better on the far side, but the overgrown track only went on as it had before. It was, if anything, a little fainter and a little narrower, and it had begun to remind Clark of roads in the fantasy epics he liked to read. Stories by people like Terry Brooks, Stephen Donaldson, and of course J.R.R. Tolkien, the spiritual father of them all. In these tales, the characters, who were usually short and had hair growing out of their pointed ears, took these neglected roads in spite of their own gloomy intuitions, and usually ended up battling trolls or boggarts or mace-wielding skeletons. "Clark, I know," he said, and hammered the wheel suddenly with his left hand, a short, frustrated stroke that succeeded only in honking the horn. "I know." He stopped the Mercedes, which now straddled the entire road. Road? Hell, lane was now too grand a word for it. Slammed the transmission into park and got out. Mary got out on the other side more slowly. The balsam smell of the trees was heavenly, and she thought there was something beautiful about the silence, unbroken as it was by the sound of any motor, even the far-off drone of an airplane, or human voice. But there was something creepy about it as well. Even the sound she could hear, the tweet of a bird in the shadowy firs, the sough of the wind, the rough rumble of the Princess diesel engine, served to emphasize the wall of quiet encircling them. She looked across the princess gray roof at Clark, and it was not reproach or anger in her gaze, but appeal. "Get us out of this, all right? Please?" "Sorry, hun," he said, and the worry she saw in his face did nothing to soothe her. "Really." She tried to speak, but at first no sound came out of her dry throat. She cleared it and tried again. "What do you think about backing up, Clark?" He considered it for several moments. The tweet bird had time to call again and be answered from somewhere deeper in the forest before shaking his head. "Only as a last resort. It's at least 2 miles back to the last fork in the road." "You mean there was another one?" He winced a little and nodded. "Backing up. Well, you see how narrow the road is and how mucky the ditches are? If we went off—" He shook his head and sighed. "So we go on." "I think so. If the road goes entirely to hell, of course I'll have to try it. But by then it'll be even farther." So far she was managing quite well, she thought, to keep the tone of accusation from creeping into her voice, but it was getting harder and harder to do. "Yes, but I like the odds of finding a wide place up ahead better than I like the odds of reversing for a couple of miles along this piece of crap. If it turns out we do have to back out, I'll take it in stages. Back up for 5 minutes, rest for 10, back up for 5 more. He smiled lamely. "It'll be an adventure." "Oh, yes," Mary said, thinking again that her definition for this sort of thing was not adventure, but pain in the ass. "Are you sure you aren't pressing on because you believe in your heart that we're going to find Toketee Falls right over the next hill?" For a moment his mouth seemed to disappear entirely, and she thought he was going to explode. Then his shoulders sagged and he only shook his head. In that moment she saw what he was going to look like 30 years from now, and that frightened her even more. "No," he said, "I guess I've given up on Toketee Falls. One of the great rules of travel in America is that roads without power lines running along at least one side of them don't go anywhere." So he had noticed too. "Come on," he said, getting back in. "I'm going to try like hell to get us out of this, and next time I'll listen to you. Promise." Yeah, Mary thought with a mixture of rueful amusement and tired resentment. "I've heard that one before." But before he could pull the transmission stick on the console down from park to drive, she put her hand over his. "I know you will," she said. "Your apology is accepted. Just be careful." "Count on it," Clark said. He gave her a small, grateful smile that made her feel proud of her restraint, and engaged the Princess transmission. The big gray Mercedes, looking very out of place in these deep woods, began to creep down the shadowed track again. Chapter 3. They drove another mile by the odometer, and nothing changed, except that the track grew narrower still. The scruffy furs now seemed to crowd right up to the car, like morbidly curious spectators at the sight of a nasty accident. If the track got any narrower, they would begin to hear the squall of branches along the sides. The ground under the trees, meanwhile, had gone from mucky to swampy. Mary could see patches of standing water, dusty with pollen and fallen pine needles, in some of the dips. Her heart was beating much too fast, and twice she had caught herself gnawing at her nails, a habit she thought she had given up for good the year before she married Clark. She had begun to realize that if they got stuck now, they would be spending the night camped out in the Princess. And there were animals in these woods. She had heard them crashing around out there. Some of them sounded big enough to be bears. The thought of meeting a bear while they stood looking at their hopelessly mired princess made her swallow hard. "Clark, I think we better give it up and try backing. It's already past 3 o'clock, and look," he said, pointing ahead. "Is that a sign?" She squinted. Ahead, the lane rose toward the crest of a deeply wooded hill. There was a bright blue oblong standing toward the top. "Yes," she said, not daring to hope, but hoping anyway. "I'm pretty sure that's what it is." "Great!" "Maybe it just says, if you came this far, you really fucked up." He shot her a complex look of amusement and irritation. "Maybe, but we're going to find out. We'll go to the top of the hill, read the sign, see what's over the crest. If we don't see anything hopeful, we'll try backing. Agreed?" "Agreed." He patted her leg, then drove cautiously on. The Mercedes was moving so slowly now that they could hear the soft sound of the weeds on the crown of the road whickering against the undercarriage. Mary could make out the words on the sign now, but at first she rejected them, thinking she had to be mistaken. It was just too crazy. But they drew closer still, and the words didn't change. "Does it say what I think it does?" Clark asked her. Mary gave a short, bewildered laugh. "I guess it does. It must be somebody's idea of a joke, don't you think?" "I don't know, but I see something else that isn't. Look, Mary." 20 or 30 feet beyond the sign, just before the crest of the hill, the road widened dramatically and was once more both paved and lined. Mary felt a large weight roll off her heart. Clark was grinning. "Isn't that beautiful?" She nodded happily, grinning herself. They reached the sign and Clark stopped. They read it again. "Welcome to Rock and Roll Heaven, Oregon. Cookin'est little town in the Pacific Northwest. J.C.'s Chamber of Commerce, lions, elks, and bears. Oh my," says Miss Murder, "this is crap." Sorry. On with the story. "It's gotta be a joke," she repeated. "Maybe not. A town called Rock and Roll Heaven? Please, Clark." "Why not? There's a town in New Mexico called Truth or Consequences, one in Nevada called Dry Shark, and one in Pennsylvania called Intercourse. So why not a rock and roll heaven in Oregon?" She laughed giddily. The sense of relief was really incredible. "You made that up." "What?" "Intercourse, Pennsylvania." "I didn't. Ralph Ginsburg once tried to send a magazine called Eros from there, for the postmark. The feds wouldn't let him. Swear. And who knows? Maybe the town was founded by a bunch of communal, back-to-the-land hippies in the 60s. They went establishment, lions, elks, JCs, but the original name stayed. He was quite taken with the idea. He found it both funny and oddly sweet. Besides, I don't think it matters. What matters is that we found some honest-to-God pavement again, honey. Pavement!" She nodded. "Drive on, Macduff, but be careful." "You bet." The princess nosed up onto the surface, which was not asphalt, but a smooth composition surface without a patch or expansion joint to be seen. "Careful's my middle Then they reached the crest of the hill and the last word died in his mouth. He stamped on the brake pedal so hard that their seat belts locked, then jammed the transmission lever back into park. "Holy wow," Clark said. Then the two of them just sat in the idling Mercedes, saying nothing else, looking down at the small, eerily perfect town of rock and roll heaven, Oregon. Chapter 4. It was nestled in a small, shallow valley like a dimple, reminding Mary inescapably of paintings like Norman Rockwell and illustration by Currier and Ives. She tried to tell herself it was just the geography, the way the road wound down into the valley, the way the town was surrounded by deep green-black forest, leagues of old, thick firs growing in unbroken profusion beyond the outlying fields. But it was more than the geography, and she supposed Clark knew it as well as she did. There was something too balanced about the church steeples, for instance, one on the north end of the town common and the other on the south end. The barn-red building had to be the schoolhouse, and the big white one with the bell tower on top and the satellite dish to one side had to be the town hall. You just knew these things somehow. The homes all looked impossibly neat and cozy, the sort of domiciles you saw in the House Beautiful ads of pre-World War II magazines, like the Saturday Evening Post and American Mercury. There should be smoke curling from a chimney or two, she thought, and after a little examination she saw that there was. "Turn around," she said abruptly. "It's wide enough here, if you're careful." He turned slowly to look at her, and she didn't care much for the look on his face. He was eyeing her as if he thought she had gone crazy. "Honey, what are you—" "I don't like it, that's all. It's too perfect." She could feel her face growing warm, but she pushed on in spite of the heat. "It makes me think of the whole town version of the candy house Hansel and Gretel found when they got lost in the woods." He went on, giving her that patented "I just don't believe it" stare of his, and she realized he meant to go down there. It was just another part of that same wretched closed loop of maleness that had gotten them off the main road in the first place. He wanted to explore, by Christ, and he wanted a souvenir, of course. A t-shirt bought in the local drugstore would do, one that said something cute like, "I've been to rock and roll heaven and you know they've got a hell of a band." "Honey," he began in that soft, tender voice that usually meant he intended to jolly her into what he had in mind or die trying. "Oh, stop. If you want to do something nice for me, turn us around and drive us back to Highway 58. If you do that, you can have some more sugar tonight. Another double helping, even if you're up to it." He fetched a deep sigh, hands on the steering wheel, eyes straight ahead. At last, not looking at her, he said, "Look across the valley, Mary. Do you see the road going up the hill on the far side?" "Yes, I do. Do you see how wide it is? How smooth? How nicely paved? Clark, that is hardly— Look, there's even an honest-to-God bus on it." He pointed at the blue bug trundling along the road toward town, its metal hide glittering hotly in the afternoon sunlight. "That's one more vehicle than we've seen on this side of the world." He grabbed the map, which had been lying on the console, and when he turned to her with it, Mary realized with dismay that the jolly, coaxing voice had temporarily concealed the fact that he was seriously pissed at her. "Listen, Mary, and pay attention because there may be questions later. Maybe I can turn her around here and maybe I can't. It's wider, but I'm not as sure as you are that that's wide enough. And the ground still looks pretty squelchy to me." "Clark, please don't yell at me. I'm getting a headache." He made an effort and moderated his voice. "If we do get turned around, it's 12 miles back to Highway 58 over the same shitty road we just traveled. 12 miles isn't so much." She tried to sound firm, if only to herself, but she could feel herself weakening. She hated herself for it, but it didn't change it. She had a horrid suspicion that this was how most men almost always got their way. In a more or less situation, it was the man who got more, and in a give and take situation, it was the guys who ended up taking and the dolls who ended up giving. Sooner or later, all that stuff they threw at you just kind of wore you down. You gave in, and why not? It was bred in the bones of 1,000 generations. Daughters of Eve who said, "Yes, dear," not just because they were trained by their mothers to do so, but because it was almost a goddamn genetic imperative, like blinking when somebody made as if they were going to chuck a rock or a ball at you. Everything you needed to know on the subject you could learn in the 2.5 minutes it took you to listen to Tammy Wynette sing "Stand By Your Man." The only thing the song neglected to say, Mary reflected, was that you usually ended up standing beside him in a pool of deep shit. "Nah, 12 miles isn't so much," he was saying in his reasonable "I wear the balls in this family" voice. "But what about the 50 or so we'll have to tack on going around this patch of woods once we get back on 58? You make it sound as if we had a train to catch, Clark. It just pisses me off, that's all. You take one look down a nice little town with a cute little name and say it reminds you of the candy house and Hansel and Gretel, and you want to go back. And that road over there," he pointed, "heads due south. It's probably less than 10 miles from here to Tuckadee Falls by that road." "I think that's about what you said when we started off on this magic carpet ride in the first place." He looked at her a moment longer, his mouth tucked in on itself like a cramp, then grabbed the transmission lever. "Fuck it," he snarled. "We'll go back. But if we meet one car on the way, Mary Kate, just one, we'll end up backing into rock and roll heaven. So—" She put her hand over his before he could disengage the transmission for the second time that day. "Go on," she said. "You're probably right, and I'm probably being silly. Bred in the goddamn bone," she thought again. "Either that or I'm just too tired to fight." She took her hand away, but he paused a moment longer, looking at her. "Only if you're sure," he said. And that was really the most ludicrous thing of all, wasn't it? Winning wasn't enough for a man like Clark. The vote also had to be fucking unanimous. She had voiced that unanimity many times when she didn't feel very unanimous in her heart, but she discovered that she just wasn't capable of giving him what he needed this time. "But I'm not sure," she said. "That's just what I've been telling you. Probably you're right, and probably I'm being silly. I mean, we all know there's no such thing as women's intuition. We're much too enlightened to believe in such things these days. But I'm still not sure. So you do what you think is right, and I'll soldier along with you, but you'll have to pardon me if I decline to put on my little cheerleader skirt this time." "Jesus," he said. His face was still wearing that uncertain expression that made him look so uncharacteristically hatefully boyish. "You're in some mood, aren't you, honey bunch?" "I guess I am," she said, hoping he couldn't see how much this term grated on her. She was 32 after all, and he was almost 41. She felt a little too old to be anybody's honey bunch, and thought Clark was a little too old to need one. Then the troubled look on his face cleared, and the Clark she liked, the one she really believed she could spend the second half of her life with, was back. And exasperated with him or not, she found that she could offer him a genuine smile, and that was something of a relief. Chapter 5. The town had no outskirts unless the few fields that surrounded it counted. At one moment they were driving down a gloomy tree-shaded lane. At the next there were broad tan fields on either side of the car. At the next they were passing neat little houses. The town was quiet but far from deserted. A few cars moved lazily back and forth on the 4 or 5 intersecting streets that made up downtown, and a handful of pedestrians strolled the sidewalks. Clark lifted a hand in salute to a bare-chested, pot-bellied man who was simultaneously watering his lawn and drinking a can of Olympia. The pot-bellied man, whose dirty hair straggled to his shoulders, watched them go by but did not raise his own hand in return. Main Street had that same weird Norman Rockwell ambiance. It was so strong that it was almost a feeling of déjà vu. The walls were shaded by well-tended oak trees, and that was somehow just right. You didn't have to see the town's only watering hole to know that it would be called the Dewdrop Inn, and that there would be a lighted clock displaying the world-famous Budweiser Clydesdales over the bar. The parking spaces were the slanting type. There was a red, white, and blue barber pole turning outside the cutting edge. A mortar and pestle hung over the door of the local pharmacy, which was called the Tuneful Druggist. One door down was a pet shop called White Rabbit. Everything was so right you could just shit. Most right of all was the town common at the center of town. There was a sign hung on a guy wire above the giant economy-sized band shell. Mary could read it easily, although they were 100 yards away. "Concert tonight," it said. She suddenly realized what really bothered her about this town. She had seen it many times before on late-night TV. It was just another version of the peculiar little town people keep stumbling into in various episodes of The Twilight Zone. She leaned toward her husband and said in a low, ominous voice, "We're traveling, not through a dimension of sight and sound, Clark, but of mind! Look!" She pointed at nothing in particular, but a woman standing outside the Rock and Roll Heaven Western Auto saw the gesture and gave her a narrow, mistrustful glance. "Look at what?" he asked. He sounded irritated again, and she guessed that this time it was because he knew exactly what she was talking about. "There's a signpost up ahead. We're entering the Oh, cut it out," Mary said, and abruptly swung into an empty parking slot halfway down Main Street. "Clark," she nearly screamed, "what are you doing?" He pointed through the windshield at an establishment with the somehow not cute name of the Rockaboogie Restaurant. "I'm thirsty. I'm going in there and getting a great big Pepsi to go. You don't have to come. You could sit right here. Lock all the doors if you want." So saying, he opened his door. Before he could swing his legs out, she grabbed his shoulder. "Clark, please don't." He looked back at her, and she saw at once that she should have canned the crack about the Twilight Zone, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. It was the macho thing again. He wasn't stopping because he thought it was okay to stop. He was stopping because this little town had scared him too. Maybe a little, maybe a lot. She didn't know that, but she did know that he had no intention of going on until he had convinced himself he wasn't afraid. Not one little bit. "I just want to get a cold drink. I won't be a minute. Do you want a ginger ale or something?" She pushed the button, then unlocked her seatbelt. "What I want is not to be left alone." He gave her an indulgent, "I knew you'd come" look that made her feel like tearing out a couple swatches of his graying hair. "And what I also want is to kick your ass for getting us into this situation in the first place," she finished, and was pleased to see the indulgent expression turn to one of wounded surprise. She opened her own door. "Come on, piddle on the nearest hydrant, Clark, and then we'll get out of here." "Piddle? Mary, what in the hell are you talking about?" "Sodas!" she nearly screamed, all the while thinking that it was really amazing how fast a good trip with a good man could turn bad. She glanced across the street and saw a couple of long-haired young guys standing there. They were also drinking Ollie and looking at her and Clark. One was wearing a battered top hat. The plastic daisy stuck in its band nodded back and forth in the breeze. His companion's arms crawled with faded blue tattoos. To Mary, they looked like the sort of fellows who dropped out of high school their third time through the 10th grade in order to spend more time meditating on the joys of drivetrain linkages and date rape. Oddly enough, they also somehow looked familiar to her. They saw her looking, and Top Hat solemnly raised his hand and waggled his fingers at her. Mary looked away hurriedly and turned to Clark. "Let's get our cold drinks and get the hell out of here." "Sure," he said, "and you didn't need to shout at me, Mary. I mean, I was right beside you, and—" "Clark, do you see those two guys across the street?" "What two guys?" She looked back in time to see Top Hat and Tattoos slipping through the barbershop doorway. Tattoos glanced back over his shoulder, and although Mary wasn't sure, she thought he winked at her. "They're just going into the barbershop. See 'em?" Clark looked, but only saw a closing door with the sun reflecting eye-watering shards of light from the glass. "What about 'em?" They looked familiar to me. Yeah? Yeah, but I find it somehow hard to believe that any of the people I know moved to rock and roll heaven, Oregon to take up rewarding high-paying jobs as street corner hoodlums. Clark snorted laughter. Come on, he said, and led her into the Rockaboogie restaurant. Chapter 6. The Rockaboogie went a fair distance toward allaying Mary's fears. She had expected a greasy spoon, not much different from the one in Oak Ridge where they'd eaten lunch. They entered an airy, sunshiny lunchroom instead, an agreeable place with blue-tiled walls, a tidy yellow oak floor, and wooden paddle fans turning lazily overhead. Two waitresses in aqua rayon uniforms that reminded Mary of American graffiti were standing by the stainless steel pass-through between the restaurant and the kitchen. One was young, little more than 20, and pretty in a washed-out way. The other, a short woman with a lot of frizzy red hair, had a brassy look that struck Mary as both harsh and desperate. And there was something else about her as well. For the second time in as many minutes, Mary had the strong sensation that she knew someone in this town. A bell above the door tinkled as they entered, and the two waitresses glanced over. "Hi there," the younger one said. "Be right with ya." "Nah, might take a while," the redhead disagreed. "We're awful busy, see?" She swept an arm at the room, deserted as only a small-town restaurant can be as the afternoon balances perfectly between lunch and dinner, and laughed cheerily at her own witticism. Like her voice, the laughter had a husky, splintered quality that Mary associated with scotch and cigarettes. "But it's a voice I know," she thought. "I'd swear it is." She turned to Clark and saw he was staring at the waitresses who had resumed their conversation as if hypnotized. She had to tug his sleeve to get his attention, then tug it again when he headed for the tables grouped on the left side of the room. She wanted them to sit at the counter, to get their damn sodas and get the hell out. "What is it?" she whispered. "Nothing," he said, "I guess. You look like you swallowed your tongue or something." "For a second or two it felt like I had," he said, and before she could ask him to explain, he had detoured to look at the jukebox. Mary sat down at the counter. "Be right with you, ma'am," the younger waitress repeated, and bent closer to hear something else her whiskey-voiced colleague was saying. Looking at her face, Mary guessed the younger woman wasn't really interested in what the older one had to say. "Mary, this is a great juke," Clark said, sounding delighted. "It's all 50s stuff. The Moonglows, the Five Satins, Shep and the Limelights, Laverne Baker. Geez, Laverne Baker singing Tweedledee. I haven't heard that one since Hector was a pup." "Well, save your money. We're just getting takeout sodas, remember?" Yeah. He walked back to the counter. Mary pulled the menu out of the bracket by the salt and pepper shakers, mostly so she wouldn't have to look at his pouty face. Look, it was saying, "I won our way through the wilderness while you slept, killed the buffalo, fought the Indians, brought you to this funky little place, and you won't even let me play Tweedledee on the jukebox. Bad, Mommy. Bad, Mommy." The menu she saw harmonized with the rayon uniforms, the 50s juke, and the general decor, which, while admirably subdued, could still only be described as mid-century rebop. The hot dog wasn't a hot dog, it was a hound dog. The cheeseburger was a chubby checker, and the quarter-pound cheeseburger was a big bopper. The specialty of the house was loaded pizza. The specialty of the house was a loaded pizza. The menu promised everything on it but the Sam, cook. "Cute," she said. "Papa ooh mau mau and all that." "What?" Clark asked, and she shook her head. The young waitress came over, taking her order pad out of her apron pocket. She gave them a smile, but Mary thought it was perfunctory. The woman looked both tired and unwell. There was a cold sore perched above her upper lip, and her eyes moved restlessly, touching on everything in the room, it seemed, except her customers. "Help you folks?" Clark moved to take the menu from Mary's hand. She held it away from him and said, "A large Coke and a large ginger ale. To go, please." "You ought to try the cherry pie," the redhead called over hoarsely. The younger woman flinched at the sound of her voice. "Rick just made it. You gonna think you died and went to heaven." She grinned at him. "Well, y'all are in heaven, but you know what I mean." "Thank you," Mary said, "but we're really in a hurry and—" "Sure, why not?" Clark said in a musing, distant voice. "2 pieces of cherry pie." Mary kicked his ankle hard, but Clark didn't seem to notice. He was staring at the redhead again, and his mouth was hung on a spring. The redhead was clearly aware of his gaze, but she didn't seem to mind. A little smile touched the corner of her lips. "2 sodas to go, 2 pieces of pie for here," the young waitress said. She gave them another nervous smile while the restless eyes examined Mary's wedding ring, the sugar shaker, one of the overhead fans. "You want that pie a la mode?" She bent and put 2 napkins and 2 forks on the counter. "Yeek," Clark began, but Mary overrode him firmly and quickly. "No!" The pie was under a plastic dome at the end of the counter. As soon as the waitress walked away in that direction, Mary leaned over and hissed, "Why are you doing this to me, Clark? You know I want to get out of here." "That waitress, that one standing down there, isn't she—" "And stop staring at her," Mary whispered fiercely. "You look like a kid trying to peek up some girl's skirt in study hall." He pulled his eyes away, but with an effort. "Is she the spit image of Janis Joplin, or am I crazy?" Startled, Mary cast another glance at the redhead. She had turned away slightly to speak to the short order cook, but Mary could still see at least 2/3 of her face, and that was enough. She felt an almost audible click in her head as she superimposed the face of the redhead over the face on record albums she still owned. Vinyl albums pressed in a year when nobody owned Sony Walkman, and the concept of the compact disc would have seemed like science fiction. Record albums now packed away in cardboard boxes from the neighborhood liquor mart and stowed away in some dusty attic alcove. Record albums with names like Big Brother and the Holding Company, Cheap Thrills, and Pearl. Her face, her sweet, homely face that had grown old and harsh and wounded too soon. Her face. Except it was more than the face, and Mary felt fear swarm into her chest, making her heart feel suddenly light and stuttery and dangerous. It was the voice. In the ear of her memory she heard Janis' chilling, spiraling scream at the beginning of "Piece of My Heart," and she laid that bluesy shout over the redhead, Scotch and Marlboro's voice, just as she had laid one face over the other. And she knew without any doubt at all that if the waitress began to sing that song, her voice would be identical to the voice of the dead girl from Texas. Because she is the dead girl from Texas. Congratulations, Mary. You had to wait until you were 32, but you finally made the grade. You finally seen your first ghost. She tried to dispute this idea, tried to point out a combination of factors, not the least of them being the stress of getting lost had caused her to make too much of a chance resemblance. But these rational thoughts, this rational voice, which ordinarily exercised a control over her life so complete it might be termed ruthless, had no chance against this new voice. She was seeing a ghost. Life within her body underwent a strange and sudden sea change. Her heart sped up from the beat to a sprint. It felt like a pumped-up runner bursting out of the blocks in an Olympic heat. Adrenaline dumped, simultaneously tightening her stomach and heating her diaphragm like a swallow of brandy. She could feel sweat in her armpits and moisture at her temples. Most amazing of all was the way the color seemed to pour into the world, making everything, the counter, the stainless steel pass-through to the kitchen, the sprays of revolving color behind the Juke's facade, seem simultaneously unreal and too real. She could hear the fans paddling the air overhead, a low rhythmic sound like a hand stroking silk, and smell the aroma of old fried meat rising from the unseen grill in the kitchen. And at the same time, she suddenly felt herself on the edge of losing her balance on the stool and swooning to the floor in a dead faint. "Get hold of yourself, woman," she told herself frantically. "You're having a panic attack, that's all. No ghosts, no goblins, no demons. Just a good old-fashioned whole-body panic attack. You've had them before, at the start of big exams in college, at school, and that time before you had to speak to the PTA. You know what it is and you can deal with it. No one's going to do any fainting around here, so just get hold of yourself. Do you hear me? She crossed her toes inside her low-top sneakers and squeezed them as hard as she could, concentrating on the sensation, using it as an effort to draw herself back to reality and get away from that too bright place she knew was the threshold of a faint. "Honey," Clark's voice from far away, "you all right?" "Yes, fine." Her voice was also coming from far away, but she knew it was closer than it would have been if she tried to speak even 15 seconds ago. Still pressing her crossed toes tightly together, she picked up the napkin the waitress had left, wanting to feel its texture. It was another connection to the world and another way to break the panicky, irrational— it was irrational, wasn't it? Surely it was— feeling that had gripped her so strongly. She raised it toward her face, meaning to wipe her brow with it, and saw that there was something written on the underside in ghostly pencil strokes that had torn the fragile paper into little puffs. Mary read this message printed in jagged capital letters: "Get out while you still can." "Mary? Mare? What is it?" The waitress, the one with the cold sore and the restless, scared eyes, was coming back with her pie. Mary dropped the napkin into her lap. "Nothing," she said calmly. As the waitress set the plates in front of them, Mary forced herself to catch the girl's eyes with her own. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," the girl mumbled, looking directly at Mary for only a moment before her eyes began to skate aimlessly around the room again. "Changed her mind about the pie, I see," Clark, the village idiot husband, was saying. There was an incredible complacent smile on his face. "Women," it said, "sometimes just leading them to the water hole ain't enough. You gotta hold their heads down and get them started. All part of the job. It ain't easy being a man, but we do our gold-darn best." "Well, it looks awfully good," she said, marveling at the even tone of her voice. She smiled at him brightly, aware that the redhead, who looked like Janis Joplin, was keeping an eye on them. "I can't get over how much she looks like," Clark began, and Mary kicked his ankle as hard as she could. He drew in a hurt, hissing breath, eyes popping wide. But before he could say anything, she shoved the napkin with its penciled message into his hand. He bent his head, looked at it, and Mary found herself praying, really praying, for the first time in perhaps 30 years. "Please, God, make him see it's not a joke. Make him see it's not a joke, because that woman doesn't just look like Janis Joplin. That woman is Janis Joplin, and I've got a horrible feeling about this town, a really horrible feeling." He raised his head, and her heart sank. There was confusion on his face and exasperation, but nothing else. He opened his mouth to speak, and it went right on opening until it looked like someone had removed the pins from places where his jaws connected. Mary turned in the direction of his gaze. The short-order cook, dressed in immaculate whites and a little paper cap cocked over one eye, had come out of the kitchen and was leaning against the tiled wall with his arms folded across his chest. He was talking to the redhead while the younger waitress stood by, watching them with an expression of pallid fright that was almost apathy. It will be apathy in another year or two, Mary thought, if she doesn't get out of here. The cook was almost impossibly handsome, so handsome that Mary found herself unable to accurately assess his age. Between 25 and 35 probably, but that was the best she could do. Like the redhead, he looked familiar. He glanced up at them, disclosing a pair of wide-set blue eyes fringed with gorgeous thick lashes, and smiled briefly at them before returning his attention to the redhead. He said something that made her caw raucous laughter. "My God, that's Rick Nelson," Clark whispered. "It can't be. It's impossible. He died in a plane crash 6 or 7 years ago, but it is." She opened her mouth to say he must be mistaken, ready to brand such an idea ludicrous, even though she herself now found it impossible to believe that the red-headed waitress was anyone but the years-dead blue shouter Janis Joplin. Before she could say anything, that click, the one that turned vague resemblance into inarguable identification, came again. Clark had been able to put the name to the face first because Clark was 8 years older. Clark had been listening to the radio and watching American Bandstand back when Rick Nelson had been Ricky Nelson, and songs like Bebop Baby and Lonesome Town were happening hits, not just dusty artifacts restricted to the golden oldie stations. Clark saw it first, but now that he had pointed it out to her, she could not unsee it. What had the red-headed waitress said? You ought to try the cherry pie. Rick just made it. There, not 20 feet away, the fatal plane crash victim was telling a joke, probably a dirty one from the looks on their faces, to the fatal drug overdose victim. The redhead threw back her head and bellowed a rusty laugh at the ceiling again. The cook smiled, the dimples at the corner of his full lips deepening prettily. And the younger waitress, the one with the cold sore and the haunted eyes, glanced over at Clark and Mary as if to ask, "Are you watching this? Are you seeing this?" Clark was still staring at the cook and waitress with that alarming expression of dazed knowledge, his face so long and drawn it looked like something glimpsed in a funhouse mirror. They'll see that if they haven't already, Mary thought, and we'll lose any chance we still have of getting out of this nightmare. I think you better take charge of the situation, kiddo, and quick. The question is, what are you going to do? She reached for his hand, meaning to grab it and squeeze it, and then decided that wouldn't do enough to alter his slack-jawed expression. She squeezed his balls instead, squeezed them as hard as she dared. Clark jerked as if someone had zapped him with a taser and swung toward her so fast he almost fell off the stool. The look of slack amazement had become one that could have been taken for sharp-eyed interest by someone who didn't know that Clark had just gotten his chimes rung by a very heavy hand. Trying to leave together would be a mistake, she was sure of that much. If they were going to get out of here, she had an idea they would have to con their way out, and she wasn't sure they could do it. If only Clark had been able to suppress that look of goggling incredulity. But it was hard to blame him for it given the circumstances. She would just have to play it by ear and hope for the best. "I left my wallet in the car," she said. Her voice sounded brittle and too loud in her own ears. "Would you get it for me, Clark?" She looked at him, lips smiling, eyes locked in his with complete concentration. She had read, probably in some shit-intensive women's magazine while waiting to get her hair done, that when you lived with the same man for 10 or 20 years, you forged a telepathic link with your partner. This link, the article went on to suggest, came in mighty handy when your hubby was bringing the boss home to dinner without phoning ahead, or when you wanted him to bring a bottle of amaretto from the liquor store and a carton of whipping cream from the supermarket. Now she tried with all her might to send a far more important message. "Go, Clark, please, go. I will give you 10 seconds and then come on the run. And if you're not in the driver's seat with a key to the ignition, I have a feeling we could seriously be fucked here." And at the same time, a deeper voice, perhaps the deepest one of all, was saying timidly, "This is all a dream, isn't it, Mary? I mean, it is, isn't it?" Clark was looking at her carefully, his eyes watering from the tweaks she had given him, but at least he wasn't complaining about it. His eyes shifted to the redhead and the short-ordered cook for a moment, saw that they were still deep in their conversation. Now she appeared to be the one who was telling a joke, then shifted back to her. "It might have slid under the seat," she said in her too loud, too brittle voice before he could reply. "It's the red one." After a moment of silence, one that seemed to last forever, Clark nodded slightly. "Okay," he said, and she could have blessed him for his nicely normal tone. "But no fair stealing my pie while I'm gone. Just get back before I finish mine and you'll be okay," she said, and tucked a forkful of cherry pie into her mouth. It had absolutely no taste at all to her. But she smiled. God, yes. Smiled like the Miss New York Apple Queen she had once been. Clark started to get off his stool, and then, from somewhere outside, came a series of amplified guitar chops. Not chords, but only open strums. Clark jerked at it as if stung, and Mary shot out one hand to clutch his arm. Her heart, which had been slowing down, broke into that nasty, scary sprint again. The redhead and the cook, even the younger waitress who, thankfully, didn't look like anyone famous, glanced casually toward the plate glass windows of the Rock-a-Boogie. "Don't let it get you, hon," the redhead said. "They're just starting to tune up for the concert tonight." "That's right," the short-order cook said. He regarded Mary with his drop-dead blue eyes. "Here in rock and roll heaven, we have a concert most every night." Yes, Mary thought, of course you do. A voice both toneless and godlike rolled across the town common, a voice almost loud enough to rattle the windows. Mary, who had been to her share of rock shows, was able to place it in clear context almost at once. It called up images of bored, long-haired roadies strolling around the stage before the lights went down, picking their way with easy grace through the forest of amps and mics, kneeling every now and then to patch two power cords together. "Test!" this voice cried. "Test! Test! Test!" Another guitar chop, still not a chord, but close this time. Then a drum run. Then a fast trumpet riff lifted from the chorus of Lennon's Instant Karma, accompanied by a light rumble of bongos. "Concert tonight," the Norman Rockwell sign over the normal Rockwell town common had said, and Mary, who had grown up in Elmira, New York, had been to quite a few free concerts on the Green as a child. Those really had been Norman Rockwell concerts with the band, made up of guys wearing their volunteer fire department uniforms in lieu of the band uniforms they couldn't afford, tootling its way through a slightly off-key Sousa marches and the local barbershop quartet plus two, harmoning on things like Roll on Shenandoah and I've Got a Gal in Kalamazoo. She had an idea that the concerts in rock and roll heaven might be quite different from those childhood concerts, where she and her friends would run around waving sparklers as twilight drew on for night. She had an idea that these concerts on the Green might be closer to Goya than Rockwell. "I'll go get your wallet," he said. "Eat your pie." "Thank you, Clark." She put another tasteless forkful of pie in her mouth and watched him head for the door. He walked in an exaggerated slow-motion saunter that struck her feverish eye as absurd and somehow horrid. "I don't have the slightest idea that I'm sharing this room with a couple of famous corpses," Clark's ambling, sauntering stride was saying. "What, me worry?" "Hurry up, Clark," she wanted to scream. "Just hurry the fuck up." The bell jingled and the door opened just as Clark reached for the knob, and two more dead Texans came in. The one wearing the dark glasses was Roy Orbison. The one wearing the horn rims was Buddy Holly. All my exes come from Texas, Mary thought wildly, and waited for them to lay their hands on her husband and drag him away. "Excuse me, sir," the man in dark glasses said politely, and instead of grabbing Clark, he stepped aside for him. Clark nodded without speaking. Mary was suddenly quite sure he couldn't speak, and stepped out into the sunshine, leaving her alone in here with the dead. And that thought seemed to lead naturally to another one even more horrible. Clark was going to drive off without her. She was suddenly sure of it, not because he wanted to, and certainly not because he was a coward. This situation went beyond questions of courage and cowardice, and she supposed that the only reason they both weren't gibbering and drooling on the floor was because it had developed so fast, but because he just wouldn't be able to do anything else. The reptile that lived on the floor of his brain, the one in charge of self-preservation, would simply slither out of its hole in the mud and take charge of things. "You've got to get out of here, Mary," the voice in her mind, the one that belonged to her own reptile, said, and the tone of that voice frightened her. It was more reasonable than it had any right to be given the situation, and she had an idea that sweet reason might give way to shrieks of madness at any moment. Mary took one foot off the rail under the counter and put it on the floor, trying to ready herself mentally for flight as she did so. But before she could gather herself, a narrow hand fell on her shoulder, and she looked up into the smiling, knowing face of Buddy Holly. Chapter 7. He had died in 1959, a piece of trivia she remembered from that movie where Lou Diamond Phillips starred as Richie Valens, and if Buddy was here, the real Richie was probably rolling around someplace too. That was more than 30 years gone, but Buddy Holly was still a gawky 23-year-old who looked 17, his eyes swimming behind his glasses and his Adam's apple bobbing up and down like a monkey on a stick. He was wearing an ugly plaid jacket and a string tie. The tie's clasp was a large chrome steer's head. The face and the taste of a country bumpkin, you would have said, but there was something in the set of the mouth that was too wise, somehow too dark. And for a moment the hand gripped her shoulder so tightly she could feel the tough pad of calluses on the end of the fingers. Guitar calluses. "Hey there, sweet thing," he said, and she could smell sweet clove gum on his breath. There was a silvery crack, hair-thin, zigzagging across the left lens of his glasses. "Ain't seen you round these parts before." Incredibly, she was lifting another forkful of pie toward her mouth, her hand not hesitating even when a clot of cherry filling plopped back onto her plate. More incredibly, she was slipping the fork through with a small, polite smile. "No," she said. She was somehow positive that she couldn't let this man see she had recognized him. If he did, any small chance she and Clark might still have would evaporate. "My husband and I are just passing through." And was Clark passing through even now, desperately keeping to the posted speed limit while the sweat trickled down his face and his eyes rolled back and forth from the mirror to the windshield to the mirror again? Was he? The man in the plaid sport coat grinned, revealing teeth that were too big and much too sharp. "Well, I sure hope you and your man can hang in for the concert tonight." Mary suddenly realized that the eye behind the cracked lens was full of blood. As Holly's grin widened, pushing the corners of his eyes into a squint, a drop of blood spilled over his lower lid and tracked down his cheek like a tear. "We put on quite a show, honey. Quite a show. Why, you wouldn't believe it." "I'm sure I would," Mary said faintly. Yes, Clark was gone. She was sure of it. Clark had left her with these dead ghouls, and she supposed that soon enough the frightened young girl with the cold sore would lead her into the back room where her own rayon uniform and order pad would be waiting. "No, sir, these shows are special." The drop of blood fell from his face and pinked onto the seat of the stool Clark had so recently vacated. "Stick around. You'll be glad y'all did. Right, Roy?" The man in the dark glasses had joined the cook and the waitresses. A Maltese cross hung in an open V of his shirt. He nodded and flashed a smile of his own. "You best be believing it, ma'am." "I'll ask my husband," she heard herself saying, and completed the thought in her mind. "If I ever see him again, that is." "You do that, sweet thing. You just do that." Then, incredibly, he was giving her shoulder one final squeeze and walking away, leaving her a clear path to the door. Even more incredibly, she could see the princess' distinct grill and Ben's hood ornament still outside. Buddy joined his friend Roy, reached behind the red-headed waitress, and goosed her. She screamed indignantly, and as she did, a flood of maggots flew from her mouth. Most spattered on the floor between her feet, but some clung to her lower lip, squirming obscenely. The young waitress turned away with a sad, sick grimace, raising one blocking hand to her face. And for Mary Willingham, running ceased to be something she had planned and became an instinctive, horrified reaction. She was up and off the stool like a shot and sprinting for the door. "Hey," the redheaded screamed. "Hey, you didn't pay for the pie or the goddamn sodas either. This ain't no dine and dat, you crotch. Rick, Buddy, get her." Mary grabbed for the doorknob and felt it slip through her sweaty fingers. Behind her she heard the thud of approaching feet. She grabbed the knob again, succeeding in turning it this time, and yanked the door open so hard she tore off the overhead bell. A narrow hand with hard calluses on the tips of the fingers grabbed her just above the elbow. This time the fingers were not just squeezing, but pinching. She felt a nerve suddenly go critical, first sending a thin wire of pain from her elbow all the way up the left side of her jaw, then numbing her arm. She swung her right fist back like a short-handed croquet mallet, connecting with what felt like the thin shield of pelvic bone above a man's groin. There was a short, pained snort, and the hand holding her arm loosened. Mary tore free and bolted through the doorway, her hair standing out around her head in a bushy corona of fright. She blessed Clark for staying. They would worry about how he had gotten them into this mess later, if there was a later, and he had understood, because he was sitting behind the wheel instead of groveling under the passenger seat for her wallet, and he keyed the princess engine the moment she came flying out of the rock-a-boogie. The man in the flower-decorated top hat and his tattooed companion were standing outside the barber shop again, watching expressionlessly as Mary yanked open the passenger door. She thought she now recognized Top Hat. She had 3 Leonard Skinner albums, and she was pretty sure he was Ronnie Van Zant. No sooner had she realized that she knew who his illustrated companion was, Dwayne Allman, killed when his motorcycle skidded beneath a tractor-trailer rig 20 years ago. He took something from the pocket of his denim jacket and bit into it. Mary saw with no surprise at all that it was a peach. Rick Nelson burst out of the rock-a-boogie. Buddy Holly was right behind him, the entire left side of his face now drenched in blood. "Get in!" Clark screamed at her. "Get in the fucking car, Mary!" She threw herself into the passenger bucket head first, and he was backing out before she could even make a try at slamming the door. The Princess' rear tires howled and sent up clouds of blue smoke. Mary was thrown forward with neck-snapping force, and her head connected with the padded dashboard. She groped behind her for the open door as Clark cursed and yanked the transmission down into drive. Rick Nelson threw himself onto the Princess Gray hood. His eyes blazed, his lips were parted over impossibly white teeth in a hideous grin. His cook's hat had fallen off, and his brown hair hung around his temples in oily snags and corkscrews. "You're coming to the show!" he yelled. "Fuck you!" Clark yelled back. He found drive and floored the accelerator. The Princess' normally sedate diesel engine gave a low scream, and the car shot forward. The apparition continued to cling to the hood, snarling and grinning in at them. "Buckle your seatbelt!" Clark bellowed. She snatched the buckle and jammed it home, watching with horrid fascination as the thing on the hood reached forward with its left hand and grabbed the windshield wiper in front of her. It began to haul itself forward. The wiper snapped off. The thing on the hood glanced at it, tossed it overboard, and reached for the wiper on Clark's side. Before he could get it, Clark tramped on the brake with both feet. Mary was thrown forward, her seatbelt locked, biting painfully into the underside of her left breast. For a moment there was this terrible feeling of pressure inside her, as if her guts were being shoved up into the funnel of her throat by a ruthless hand. The thing on the hood was thrown clear and landed in the street at least 20 feet in front of the car. Mary heard a brittle crunching sound, and blood splattered the pavement in a starburst pattern around its head. She glanced back and saw the others running toward the car. Janice was leading them, her face twisted into a hag-like grimace of hate and excitement. In front of them, the short-order cook sat up with the boneless ease of a puppet. The big grin was wider than ever. "Clark, they're coming!" Mary screamed. He glanced briefly into the rear view, then floored the accelerator again. The Princess leaped ahead. Mary had time to see the man sitting in the street raise one arm to shield his face, and wished that was all she'd had time to see. But there was something else as well, something worse. Beneath the shadow of his raised arm, she thought he was still grinning. Then the Princess, doing 20 miles an hour and still accelerating, hit him and bore him under. There were crackling sounds that reminded her of a couple of kids rolling in a pile of autumn leaves. She clapped her hands over her ears. Too late, and screamed. "Don't bother," Clark said. He looked grimly into the rearview mirror. "He's getting up. No harm, no foul." "What?" "Except for the tire track across his shirt, He broke off abruptly, looking at her. "Who hit you, Mary?" "What?" "Your mouth is bleeding. Who hit you?" She put a finger to the corner of her mouth, looked at the red smear on it, and tasted it. "Not blood. Cherry pie," she said, and uttered a high-pitched, desperate laugh. "Get us out of here, Clark. Please get us out." "You bet," he said, and turned his attention back to Main Street, which was wide and empty. Mary noticed that, electric guitars on the common or not, there were no more power lines on this street than there had been on the sides of the road that had led them here. And there really wasn't anything strange about that, was there? If you were a rock and roll ghost, Oregon Hydroelectric would probably be the least of your worries. The Princess was gaining speed, as all diesel seemed to. Not fast, but with a kind of relentless strength, and spreading a dark brown cloud of exhaust behind her. Mary caught a blurred glimpse of a department store, a bookstore, and a maternity shop called Rock and Roll Lullaby. She saw a young man with shoulder-length brown curls standing outside the Rock'em and Sock'em Billiards Emporium with his arms folded across his chest and one snakeskin boot propped against a whitewashed brick. His face was handsome in a heavy, pouting way, and Mary had time to recognize him. The Lizard King himself. "That was Jim Morrison," Clark said in a dry, emotionless voice. "I know, I saw." Yes, she saw, but the images were like dry paper bursting into flame under a relentless, focused light that seemed to fill her mind. It was as if the intensity of her horror had turned her into a human magnifying glass, and she understood that if they got out of here, no memories of this peculiar little town would remain. The memories would be just ashes blowing in the wind. That was the way these things worked, of course. A person could not retain such hellish images, such hellish experiences, and remain rational. So the mind turned into a blast furnace, crisping each one as soon as it was created. And that's why most people can still afford the luxury of disbelieving such things as ghosts and haunted houses, she thought. Because when the mind is turned toward the terrifying and the irrational, like a woman who is turned and made to look upon the face of Medusa, it forgets. It has to forget. And God, except for getting out of this hell, forgetting is the only thing in the world I want. She saw a little cluster of people standing on the tarmac of a city service station at an intersection near the far end of town. They wore frightened, ordinary faces above faded, ordinary clothes. A man in an oil-stained mechanic's coverall. A woman in a nurse's uniform, white once maybe, now a dingy gray. An older couple, she in orthopedic shoes, and he with an hearing aid the size of a cherry tomato in one ear, clinging to each other like children who fear they are lost in the deep, dark woods. Mary understood without needing to be told that these people, along with the younger waitress, were the real residents of Rock and Roll Heaven, Oregon, and they were prisoners. "Please get us out of here, Clark," she said. "Please." Something tried to come up her throat, and she clapped her hands over her mouth, sure she was going to upchuck. Instead of vomiting, she uttered a loud belch that burned her throat like fire and tasted of the pie she had eaten in the Rockaboogie restaurant. "We'll be okay. We're almost out of town. Take it easy, Mary." The road, she could no longer think of it as Main Street now that she had seen the end of town just ahead, ran past the Rock and Roll Heaven Municipal Fire Department on the left and the school on the right. Even in her heightened state of terror, there seemed something very funny about a citadel of learning called the Rock and Roll Grammar School. 3 children stood in the playground adjacent to the school, watching with apathetic eyes as the princess tore past. Up ahead, the road curved around an outcrop with a sign planted on it. "You are now leaving Rock and Roll Heaven. Good night, sweetheart, good night." Clark swung the princess into the curve without slowing, and on the far side there was a bus blocking the road. It was no ordinary yellow bus. It raved and rioted with 100 colors and 1,000 psychedelic swoops, an oversized souvenir of the summer of love. The windows flocked with butterfly decals and peace signs, and even as Clark screamed and brought his feet down on the brake, she read, with a fatalistic lack of surprise, the words floating up the painted side like overfilled dirigibles: "The Magic Bus." Clark gave it his best, but wasn't quite able to stop. The princess slid into the Magic Bus at 10 or 15 miles an hour, her wheels locked and her tires smoking fiercely. There was a hollow bang as the Mercedes hit the tie-dyed bus amidships. Mary was thrown forward against her safety harness again. The bus rocked on its springs a little, but that was all. "Back up and go around!" she screamed at Clark, but she was nearly overwhelmed by a suffocating intuition that it was all over. The princess engine sounded choppy, and Mary could see steam escaping from around the front of the crumpled hood. It looked like the beneath of a wounded dragon. When Clark dropped the transmission lever down into reverse, the car backfired twice and died. Behind them they could hear an approaching siren. She wondered who the town constable would turn out to be. Not John Lennon, whose life's motto had been "Question Authority," Not Morrison, who was clearly one of the town's pool hall bad boys. Who? Did it really matter? Maybe she thought it'll turn out to be Jimi Hendrix. That sounded crazy, but she knew her rock and roll probably better than Clark, and she remembered reading that Hendrix had been a jump jockey in the 101st Airborne. And didn't they say that ex-service people often make the best law enforcement officials? You're going crazy, she told herself, then nodded. Sure she was, why not? What now? She asked Clark dully. He opened his door, having to put his shoulder into it because it crimped a little in the frame. Now we run, he said. What's the point? You saw them. Do you want to be them? That rekindled some of her fear. She released the clasp on her seatbelt and opened her own door. Clark came around the princess and took her hand. As they turned back toward the magic bus, his grip tightened painfully as he saw who was stepping off. A tall man in an open-throated white shirt, dark dungarees, and wraparound sunglasses. His blue-black hair was combed back from his temples in a lush and impeccable duck-asses haircut. There was no mistaking those impossible, almost hallucinatory good looks. Not even sunglasses could hide them. The full lips parted in a small, sly smile. A blue and white police cruiser with Rock and Roll Heaven PD written on the doors came around the curve and screeched to a stop, inches from the prince's back bumper. The man behind the wheel was black, but he wasn't Jimi Hendrix after all. Mary couldn't be sure, but she thought the local law was Otis Redding. The man in the shades and black jeans was now standing directly in front of them, his thumbs hooked into his belt loop, his pale hands dangling like dead spiders. How y'all today? There was no mistaking that slow, slightly sardonic Memphis drawl either. Want to welcome you both to town. Hope you can stay with us a while. Town ain't much to look at, but we're neighborly and we take care of our own. He stuck out a hand on which 3 absurdly large rings glittered. I'm the mayor around these parts. Name's Elvis Presley. Chapter 8. Dusk of a Summer Night. As they walked onto the town common, Mary was again reminded of the concert she had attended in Elmira as a child, and she felt a pang of nostalgia and sorrow penetrate the cocoon of shock that her mind and emotions had wrapped around her. So much was the same, but so much was different too. There were no children waving sparklers. The only kids present were half a dozen or so huddled together as far from the bandshell as they could get, their pale faces strained and watchful. The kids she and Clark had seen in the grammar school play yard when they made their abortive escape attempt were among them. And it was no quaint brass band that was going to play in 15 minutes or half an hour either. Spread across the bandshell, which looked almost as big as a Hollywood Bowl to Mary's eyes, were the implements and accessories of what had to be the world's biggest and loudest, judging from the amps, rock and roll band, an apocalyptic bebop combination that would, at full throttle, probably be loud enough to shatter window glass 5 miles away. She counted a dozen guitars on stands and stopped counting. There were 4 full drum sets, bongos, congas, a rhythm section, circular stage pop-ups where the backup singers would stand, a steel forest of mics. The common itself was filled with folding chairs. Mary estimated somewhere between 700 and 1,000, but she thought there were no more than 50 spectators actually present and probably fewer. She saw the mechanic, now dressed in clean jeans and a perma-press shirt, sitting next to a woman with a careworn face who was probably his wife. The nurse was sitting all by herself in the middle of a long, empty row. Her face was turned upwards, and she was watching the first few glimmering stars come out. Mary looked away from the woman quickly. She felt if she looked at that sad, longing face for too long, her heart would break. Of the town's more famous residents, there was currently no sign. Of course not. Their day jobs were behind them now, and they would all be backstage, dressing in their sequins and checking their cues, getting ready for tonight's show. Clark paused about a quarter of the way down the grassy central aisle. A puff of evening breeze tousled his hair, and Mary thought it looked dry as straw. There were lines carved into Clark's forehead and around his mouth that she had never seen before. He looked as if he had lost 30 pounds since lunch in Oak Ridge. That was impossible, of course, but knowing that didn't change her impression. "And just how do you think you look, beautiful?" she told herself. "Where do you want us to sit?" Clark asked. His voice was thin and uninterested, the voice of a man who still believes he is dreaming. Mary spotted the waitress with the cold sore. She was on the aisle about 4 rows down, now dressed in a light gray blouse and cotton skirt. She had thrown a sweater over her shoulders. "There," Mary said, and Clark led her in that direction without question. She looked around at Mary and Clark, and Mary saw that her eyes had at least settled down tonight, which was something of a relief. A moment later she realized why. The girl was apocalyptically stoned. Mary looked down, not wanting to meet that dusty stare any longer. It was somehow like looking at someone whose pants have fallen down. And when she did, she saw the waitress' left hand was wrapped in a bulky white bandage. Mary realized with dim horror that the last 2 fingers on the bandaged hand were gone. "Hi," the girl said. "I'm Sissy Thomas." "Hello, Sissy. I'm Mary Willingham. This is my husband, Clark." "Pleased to meet you," the waitress said. "Your hand," Mary trailed off, not sure how to go on. "Frankie did it," Sissy spoke with deep indifference of one who was riding the pink horse down Dream Street. "Frankie Lyman. Everyone says he was the sweetest guy you'd ever want to meet while he was alive, and he only turned mean when he came here. He was one of the first ones, the pioneers, I guess you'd say. I don't know about that. If he was sweet before, I only know that he's meaner than cat dirt now. I don't care. I just wish he'd gotten away, and I'd do it again. Besides, Crystal takes care of me." Sissy nodded toward the nurse, who had stopped looking at the stars and was now looking at them. "Crystal takes real good care. She'll fix you up if you want. You don't need to lose no fingers if you want to get stoned in this town." "My wife and I do not use drugs," Clark said, sounding pompous. Sissy regarded him without speaking for a few moments. Then she said, "You will." "When does the show start?" Mary could feel the cocoon of shock starting to erode, and she didn't much care for the feeling. "Soon." "How long do these concerts go on?" Sissy didn't answer for a long time, and Mary was getting ready to restate the question, thinking the girl either hadn't heard or hadn't understood, when she said, "A long time. The show will be over at midnight. They always are, but still, they go on a long time, because time is different here, dig me? Different. It might be, I don't know. I think when the guys really get cooking, they sometimes go on for a year or more." A cold, gray frost began creeping up Mary's arms and back. She tried to imagine having to sit through a year-long rock show and couldn't do it. "This is a dream and you'll wake up," she told herself. But that thought, persuasive enough as they stood listening to Elvis Presley in the sunlight by the Magic Bus, was now losing a lot of its force and believability. "Driving out this road here won't do you no good nohow," Elvis told them. "It don't go no place but Umpqua Swamp. No roads in there, just a lot of quicksand and other things." "Bears," the policeman, who might be Otis Redding, had said from behind him. "Bears, yep," Elvis agreed. Then his lips had curled up in the too knowing smile Mary remembered so well from TV and movies. "And other things." Mary began. "If we stay for the show," Elvis nodded emphatically. "The show? Yeah, you gotta stay for the show. We really rock. You just see if we don't." "Ain't nothing but a stone fact," the police had added. "If we stay for the show, can we go when it's over?" Elvis and the cop had exchanged a look. "Well, you know, ma'am," the erstwhile king of rock and roll said at last, "we're real far out in the boonies here, and attracting an audience is kind of slow work. Although once they hear us, everybody stays around for more. And we was kind of hoping you'd stick around yourselves for a while, see a few shows, and kind of enjoy our hospitality." He had pushed his sunglasses up on his forehead then, for a moment revealing eye sockets that were horribly blank, the emptily thoughtful eyes of a skull. Then there were Elvis' dark blue eyes again, regarding them with somber interest. "I think," he said, "you might even decide you want to settle down." Chapter 9. There were more stars in the sky now. It was almost full dark. Over the stage, orange spots were coming on, soft as night-blooming flowers, illuminating the mic stands one by one. They gave us jobs, Clark said dully. He gave us jobs. The mayor, the one who looks like Elvis Presley. He is Elvis, Sissy Thomas said, but Clark just went on staring at the stage. He was not prepared to even think this yet, let alone hear it. Mary is supposed to go to work in the beauty bar tomorrow, he went on. She has a teacher's certificate and an English degree, but she's supposed to spend the next God knows how long as a shampoo girl. Then he looked at me and he says, "What about you, sir? What's your specialty?" Clark spoke in a vicious imitation of the mayor's Memphis drawl, and at last a genuine expression began to show in the waitress' stoned eyes. Mary thought it was fear. "You hadn't ought to make fun," she said. "Making fun can get you in trouble around here, and you don't want to get in trouble." She slowly raised her bandage-wrapped hand. Clark stared at it, wet lips quivering until she lowered it in her lap again, and when he spoke again it was in a lower voice. "I told him I was a computer software expert, and he said there weren't any computers in town, although they sure would might get a ticketron out there too." Then the other guy laughed and said there was a stock boy's job open down at the Super Ed, and a bright white spotlight speared the forestage. A short man in a sport coat so wild it made Buddy Holly's look tame strode into its beam, his hand raised as if to stifle a huge comber of applause. "Who's that?" Mary asked Sissy. "Some old-time disc jockey used to run a lot of those shows. His name's Alan Tweed or Alan Breed or something like that. We hardly ever see him except here. I think he drinks. He sleeps all day, that I do know." And as soon as the name was out of the girl's mouth, the cocoon that had sheltered Mary disappeared, and the last of her disbelief melted away. She and Clark had stumbled into rock and roll heaven, only it was actually a rock and roll hell. This had not happened because they were evil people. It had only happened because it could happen, like car accidents and heart attacks and plane crashes and cancer. They had gotten lost, that was all. It could happen to anybody. "Got a great show for ya tonight," Freed was shouting enthusiastically into his mic. "We got J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, Mark Bolan of T-Rex, just back from a sold-out gig at the Albert Hall, Jim Croce, my main man Johnny Ace." Mary leaned toward the girl. "How long have you been here, Sissy?" "I don't know. It's easy to lose track of time. 6 years at least. Or maybe it's 8. Or 9. Keith Moon of The Who, Brian Jones of The Stones, that cute little Florence Ballard of The Supremes." Articulating her worst fear, Mary asked, "How old were you when you came?" "Cass Elliot, Janis Joplin, 23, King Curtis, Johnny Burnett." "And how old are you now?" "Slim Harpo, Bob Bear Height." 23, Sissy told her, and on stage Alan Freed went on screaming names at the almost empty town common. As the stars came out, first 100 stars, then 1,000, then too many to count. Stars that had come out of the blue and now glittered everywhere in the black. He told the names of drug ODs, the alcohol ODs, the plane crash victims, the shooting victims, the ones who had been found in alleys, ones who had been found in swimming pools, and the ones who had been found in roadside ditches with steering columns poking out of their chests and most of their heads torn off their shoulders. He chanted the names of the young ones and the old ones, but mostly they were young ones, and as he spoke the names of Ronnie Van Zant and Steve Gaines, she heard the words of one of their songs tolling her in her mind, the one that went, "Ooh, that smell. Can't you smell that smell?" And yes, you bet she certainly could smell that smell. Even out here in the clear Oregon air, she could smell it. And when she took Clark's hand, it was like taking the hand of a corpse. "All right!" Alan Freed was screaming. Behind him, in the darkness, scores of shadows were trooping onto the stage, some of them lit upon their way by roadies with penlights. "Are you ready to party?" No answer from the scattered spectators on the common, but Freed was waving his hands and laughing as if some vast audience were going crazy with assent. There was just enough light left in the sky for Mary to see the old man reach up and turn off his hearing aid. Are you ready to boogie? This time he was answered by a demonic shriek of saxophones from the shadows behind him. Then let's go, because rock and roll will never die. As the show's lights came up and the band swung into the first song of that night's long, long concert, I'll Be Doggone, with Marvin Gaye doing the vocal, Mary thought, that's what I'm afraid of. That's exactly what I am afraid of.